All right, come on in. We'll get started. How's everybody doing today? Good. Everybody doing good? You know, there are three major events, changes of environment that happened during the intertestamental period that are significant events to God's people, and this is the first one of those. So it's taken us a few weeks to get to this point, but you know it's been kind of a setup for the environment and what happened to them and who they are when they come back. And this is now the first major thing that's going to happen to them. The world's going to be turned upside down after being essentially stable for 150 years or so. And so you have now a couple more generations come and go, right? So the people that are living in... is that like a phone call that happens at the same time, or is that?
It's sort of alarm.
Oh, I got it. Class is starting. Love it. So you know, God's people are living here in this Persian province of Ehud, and we've now had several generations turn over. So the people that are there now, this is all they know, right? This is all they've ever known. They know that they have a Persian king. They know that they don't speak the same language as these spiritual writings that have been preserved for them. They know that the temple they have is not the original temple that they read about, right? They're probably looking at that and probably some confusion there. But they know that God's brought them through this, and you know, they've had this 3 or 4 cleansings that have happened along this time. So these people seem to be very focused. Their leadership is essentially the religious leadership rather than having a Jewish king. And they've been fairly content to move along in this path. I think they're waiting for the Messiah to come. You know, they're thinking a lot about God's promises, and they now know who they are, right? And just when we get comfortable, just when we think everything's going to be this way forever, and this is how things are always going to be, things change. And the change is mainly brought about by this gentleman, Alexander III of Macedon. In our last installment, we talked about that Alexander and his father rose up here in the area of Macedonia, which is just north of Greece proper here. And Philip, his father, had conquered all of that and united it into a major Greek state, with the exception of Sparta. Sparta's kind of left out here, and Sparta's been kind of an instrument through which Persia has kind of meddled a little bit in the Greek area there. And so now we're at this point where Alexander is going to take control and change the events. What is he referred to in the book of Daniel? Remember that? We talked about that a couple times.
Ram's horn. One horn, right?
The shaggy goat with a prominent horn, right? So in other words, a shaggy goat, I don't know what that means. I'm not David's the goat guy. He knows. Is a shaggy goat like a real aggressive goat or something? I have no idea. It's like
Linda might know.
Anything? A shaggy goat. Does that mean anything? I don't know. But
very hairy.
Very hairy goat.
Yeah.
That's interesting. With a prominent horn. And we said that the animal represents the kingdom, and the horn represents a king. So you've got a very large, prominent horn, just telling us that this is a very influential, prominent king of this empire that's going to come from the west. So what about Alexander III? What do we know about him today? Well, he was born on what we think to be July 20th, 356 BC, to Philip II, who was the king of Macedonia. And he was the leader of the League of Corinth, which was the kind of the association of all of those independent Greek kingdoms down there. His mother was someone named Olympias. It's kind of interesting. Are you picking up all the Greek theology come in here, right? So Alexander's mother is Olympias. You know, kind of interesting.
Another word for shaggy was rough.
Rough? Okay.
So he's kind of a rough leader, kind of always fighting, always...
Well, yeah, this is the goat, right? So it's a rough goat. Yeah, it's a rough, always fighting.
Not one of those regal people.
Not a well-groomed Shih Tzu.
Yes.
Right? Anybody's ever had a Shih Tzu? If you don't keep well-groomed, they turn into a little tribble. So that's good. Yeah, kind of rough. So Olympias was Philip's principal wife, although she was his 4th wife. But his principal wife, this is why Alexander achieved this area of prominence in his family. He succeeded his father to the throne in 336 BC. 336. So this is the time frame we're talking about here. 336 BC, Alexander succeeds his father, but the next 2 years is just a story of unbelievable warfare and conflict to try and consolidate his throne. Remember we talked about this last week? The cycle that always happens in these kingdoms? What's the cycle? New king comes in, what's the cycle?
You got to get rid of competition.
Got to get rid of the competition. Pretty much kills the competitors.
Peace for a while.
What's that?
Peace for
Peace
a
for a little while, and then a challenge arises, right? So that's essentially what happens here. But he spends about 2 years battling all the competitors around this area who rise up and try and take over. But he consolidates the empire, and by the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history, and we'll see that here in a minute. He was undefeated in battle, widely considered to be one of history's greatest, most successful military commanders, never lost a battle. Until the age of 16, he was tutored by Aristotle. It's kind of interesting. When Philip became the leader of this area, he kind of had his choice of who would come and tutor his sons, and there was a competition there. And the idea was, whoever gets chosen, I would build a school for you. And so Aristotle kind of won that competition. So we hear about Aristotle today. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. This is winner's history, right, that we read from. So Aristotle's a prominent name because he was the tutor of the guy who ends up being in charge, right? So we know a lot about Aristotle. He taught Aristotle about medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic, art, those types of things. And then we see this kind of thinking permeate this part of the world as Alexander comes through and starts to change the landscape. He had a passion, Alexander developed a passion for the works of Homer. If you know anything about Homer, that's the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the primary works there, talking about the Troy and things like that. So he had a real appreciation for history and conquest and achievement. And in his youth, he was acquainted with Persian exiles in Macedonia. There were some Persian exiles who made their way over here who weren't happy with things here. Remember, there was a lot of conflict that took place. So some people from the Persian court ended up in the Macedonian court over here. So Alexander made acquaintance with them, learned about Persian customs. It was almost like you're doing a lot of research on who's eventually going to be your enemy, right? Let's bring some of those guys in close, learn about them. That's a lot of what he did. So he was mentored by some of them. He learned a lot about them. By about the age of 16, Alexander's education at Aristotle ends. And then Philip II, he had waged war against Thrace in the north, but this wasn't totally successful. There's some argument about whether or not this was actually ever subdued or not. So there was a part of the kingdom there that really wasn't totally subdued. But the big target was to the east. Anybody remember why this big target to the east? Why would Alexander care about that now that he's king of Greece? Who cares about Persia? Revenge, yeah. For what?
For them being they were part of Persia, kind of, and they were under the rule of Persia.
Yeah, especially Macedonia. Remember, he's a Macedonian, right? So he's up until his father comes along, this is a Persian province for a very, very long time. So they've been under Persian rule, and then we know that there was the Greco-Persian War where Athens, kind of the center of culture, had been destroyed and burned. So there's this. Back in those days, man, there was this sense of, I've got to exact revenge on my people for honor. And there was a lot of that. I'm the leader now. And remember, he's probably brought up with this thought and this preparation and this idea that you are going to be the instrument through which, the gods exact revenge on these pagans to the east, right? That's a lot of the thinking there. So Alexander did become king of Macedon under some very suspicious circumstances. There had been some intrigue about whether or not his father intended to make Alexander his heir, because shortly before Philip died, he had an infant son through a Macedonian wife, where Alexander's mother was not purely Macedonian. There was some question about whether this is really legitimate or not. And remember that when you're talking about royal blood back in those days, this was important. This is an important thing to know, right? Kind of like having a mixed breed king or something, right? So there was some little bit of an intrigue there about whether Philip intended that to happen. Remember, Philip was assassinated, so there was not a smooth transition there. So it was kind of a fight for the throne. It was the ultimate game of survivor, basically. But regardless, in 335 or so, he starts to consolidate power and campaign all through the Balkans here to consolidate that power. So Alexander then becomes the leader of the League of Corinth. He used his authority to launch a pan-Hellenic project that his father assumed, right, had kind of proposed to unite it all in one army and be an active, proactive, intentional force in the world rather than just sitting back and being thinkers anymore. So he seemed to have some stability, but there still was some unrest back there. But he had now a single army, a single Greek army under Macedonian leadership, and he starts his appointments. That brings us to the counterpart. His counterpart is Darius III of Persia. Now, this picture here is a contemporary mosaic. This is what we believe Alexander looked like. If you Google any images of him, this is a mosaic that we believe is contemporary. So it's either done shortly after his death or right around that time. So it's very interesting to take a glimpse of what these people really looked like at that time. And you have King Darius III of Persia. Remember what we said about the Persian king succession routine? It's this constant cycle of assassination, consolidation, couple natural deaths in there, but for the most part, kings are achieving the throne through some type of action. This one was one of the most crazy ones. He was a distant member of the Achaemenid dynasty, which was the Persian dynasty. He was not a direct line of succession to the throne. So again, you've got somebody who made their way in there through some other things. He did establish a reputation as a competent and brave military leader during some battles across the empire, put down rebellions. Remember, most of what they had, they weren't in expansion mode anymore. The Persians were more interested in keeping peace throughout the empire. And this is a huge empire. And when you look at this empire, just think about Persia for a minute. Where do you think most of the trouble would come from? I heard it.
Egypt.
Egypt, yeah. This is where most of the trouble comes from. You think these guys at all like being Persian subjects? I mean, for centuries, Egypt is the driving force in the world, right? For art and science. I mean, these guys really didn't like it at all. So you had a lot of, remember, there were wars for a long time to try and establish supremacy here in this area. This area was fought over a lot. So they had a lot of trouble keeping peace down in Egypt. So that was the main, so there were battles going on, but they were mostly battles of rebellion. He had been made chief priest of the postal service, which was considered a very important role at that time. You think about what it took to get goods or correspondence all around that kingdom back then. I mean, think about that took. So he came to the throne under some very dramatic and unique circumstances. Artaxerxes III was the king of Persia up until about 338. He had been killed when one of the court eunuchs named Bagoas had him poisoned. This guy, this is like a scene way straight out of Game of Thrones. You get this guy who goes around poisoning people, and it's all because he's kind of like the puppet master in the background, right? I've got this guy over here that I can control, and so I'm going to eliminate all the people that help him eventually get to the throne. That's what he does. He goes around just poisoning people, and it becomes kind of known that he's the one that's doing the poisoning, but the person that becomes king as a result of that is okay with that. Until this king isn't okay, and then what do you think happens to him? He gets poisoned, and he puts another guy in place. And so actually what had happened was the king before Darius had been poisoned by this guy so that he could put Darius on the throne. So Darius gets there because this creepy guy goes around and takes people out, right? But then he figures out eventually this guy's going to get me. I mean, it's like the ultimate Rubik's Cube, right? I'm just moving pieces around until I can get I've got plans for this guy or for maybe me to get there, and I just keep eliminating people and moving them. So he finally figures that out. They have this big banquet, and he knows, he gets wind that this guy Bagoas is going to poison him. So at the banquet, he forces him to exchange glasses, and this guy's forced to drink the poison, which is great. I mean, what a great story! Like, he makes movies like this. So that's how Darius eliminates his threat, and now he's safe. And so he is the king. He's kind of content to just be back here and be the king. And just so you know, the capital is way over here on this map. I'm going to show you a better map on the slide here in a bit. But their capital is way over here in what is modern-day Iran. So they're kind of way down here on the Persian Gulf coast. So he's just kind of content to be the king and just kind of survived a bunch of craziness and assassination attempt. And I'm just going to kind of, sit here and chill out and rest. He's not really paying too much attention to what's going on outside. So at the same time that he comes to the throne, Alexander comes to the throne across. So you can see these two guys come up almost simultaneously. Now, Philip, Alexander's father, did manage to send about 10,000 troops over here to Ionia right before he died. Sent an army over there to basically just kind of grab control. Remember there was a whole peace treaty that Persia wasn't to put an army over here. Remember, that kind of let these Greeks kind of be alone. These are Greek cities along the coast here. This is a long way from the capital. I mean, think about how long it would take to get word from here to the capital that there's some Greeks, that have come across the Hellespont here, right? So he ends up getting these 10,000 Greeks parked there, kind of like an advanced force, but then Philip dies. So it takes a couple years for Alexander to get everything together. Meanwhile, these guys are just like pulling their heels here, like, how long are we going to kind of wait here? But the good thing is, or the thing is, when it comes time for Alexander to launch his campaign, he's already got an army sitting here. But during that time, you started to get some paranoia, and they started to slowly move some troops that way, like, what's going on over there? Now that the scene is set here now for what will be one of the greatest clashes in military history. So this map, this shows you a map of the Persian Empire. So everything in yellow there is the Persian, this ends up being Alexander's empire, but everything other than this is Persian, right? This over here is Alexander. Everything yellow to the east there, that's all Persian. So now is the time to attack. So you see, I hope you can see these. You got these little swords. Those show the battles. The first clash is at the Battle of the Granicus River, right across the way. You can see by this point the Persians do arrive there with an army. Darius stays home. He doesn't show up. He just sends somebody over. Remember, he gets word that there's 10,000 Greeks here, right? Still sends a pretty sizable army, but doesn't really completely understand what's happening left. Because Alexander now had sent another 37,000. So now he's got 47,000 Greeks ready to go. And the Persians show up with about, not an extremely much bigger force, but a bigger force. They show up with some cavalry and things like that. But they meet for the first time in May of 334 at the Granicus River, right across the Hellespont here. And who do you think wins?
Alexander.
The Greeks. Yeah, Alexander wins. Yeah. Darius never shows up. He didn't think that there was a reason to. He didn't really think either that the Greeks' intent was to conquer Persia. I mean, he wasn't really thinking about this, because everything all from this time was these Greeks along the edge here, right? So he's not thinking that my whole kingdom's at risk here. If he'd have known that, I mean, he'd have sent 500,000 guys and probably crushed them right there, right? So it was a little not really understanding what was going to happen. He also thought that some of these satraps could probably deal with this. The local militias could probably deal with this problem without having to send a whole army up there. So he decided to remain back here at Persepolis, which is their capital. You can see it right here. So the capital's way down here. Here's Persepolis. That's a long way from Asia Minor, right? I mean, for the king to go that far, it's got to be a pretty big deal. So he doesn't head that way.
That's a long way for us today.
That's a long way. Yeah, that's a couple tankers. Yeah, to do it that way. Yeah. So I mean, just think about back in those days. You're essentially moving by foot. You know, even if you send your cavalry up there and your chariots, it's going to take your infantry weeks to walk that far, right? It's going to take them quite a ways. It's going to take them quite a while to get there. So Alexander wins this, and so he starts overcoming a bunch of cities and liberating. There are a couple Greek towns here that don't want to cooperate. He runs into that. Because remember, these guys have been Persian now for generations. And so they might be like, hey, it's kind of fun. You know, so it does actually slow them up a little bit, but he overcomes them. He lays siege to this town called Halicarnassus. I hope I pronounced that right down here, and that does slow them down. It's right about here. It's up in this area here. And it slows them down long enough for the Persians to finally show up with a couple 100,000 guys. So they meet again at the Battle of Issus, right here. If you just look at this, even if you don't see any of this map, what do you think's happening? What's it look like? He's moving that way, man. Now, Darius has the point. Hey, he's coming this way, right? He's at least going to take all of Asia Minor, maybe all of old Assyria and Babylon. He's coming this way. So you can see the strategic plan here, right? Come here, eventually moves down the coast, liberates Egypt. Right now you have an ally behind you. So this Battle of Issus is now the big one. This is 333 BC. It's taken 3 years to get to this point. And this is a great battle. Alexander is outnumbered 2-1, but still manages to outmaneuver and outflank Darius. Still defeats him, and it's really just a classic moment here. At the Battle of Issus here, the moment the Persian left flank went to pieces, Darius in his war chariot saw he was cut off and ran and abandoned his army and abandoned a couple 100,000 guys. And of course, back in those days, I mean, the king was there with the big flag, and I mean, this was a major thing. This would be like, if I knew the general bolted, what am I going to do? The word came up, the general ran away. What are we going to do? We're going to run. We're going to go, I surrender, right? So when he runs, it's just a total slaughter. And so he left behind his chariot, his bow, his royal mantle, all of which later picked up by Alexander. In fact, he fled so fast that Alexander captured Darius' headquarters and takes his entire family prisoner. Takes Darius' entire family, including his mother. So he shows up with his family. His mom's there to watch the battle. And so he just runs. And so mom's left behind, and all of a sudden now she's a prisoner. Now, this is where Alexander activates all the good stuff that Aristotle taught him. Right? What would be the natural inclination before this to do? If this had been 500 years earlier, what do you think they would have done? What's that? Kill them all. Yeah, put their heads on fire. Right? That's what they would have done. What's Alexander do? He adopts him as his mother. Hey, come on, be my. And she adopts him as her son. They're all of a sudden he's like, hey, I'm Persian too. Your king abandoned you. I'm here to liberate you, right? Next, she actually ends up adopting him as her adoptive son. My son fled and left me. You're not my king. That's what happened. So, I mean, really a PR coup here. I mean, it looks really bad for Darius at this point. Darius petitioned Alexander through letters several times to get his family back. Alexander always says no. He says, I'm only going to do it if you declare me the new emperor of Persia. Of course, Darius can't do that. So now with essentially the Persian frontline army destroyed, Alexander's free to do what he wants. So what he does is he comes down the coast. Remember, you've got Greece back here, right? If you just all of a sudden head into the hinterland, you might not be able to supply it very well. Besides that, you don't know really what's going on down here with regards to armies. So you can see his strategies to come down the coast. Has a huge siege and battle at the city of Tyre. You probably read about Tyre. It shows up in the Bible. Mm-hmm. These guys tried to put up a fight. Tyre is it's a city on an island out here. Just off, this is not the scale. It's a city on an island, essentially. Most of it's on an island. So they think, well, we can hang out here. You really can't do anything about us. We can last out here a few years. You know what Alexander does? he builds a causeway out of dirt and mud. Just builds it. I'm gonna come get you. Builds this causeway. It takes him several months to do it, and then marches the army in, wipes the place out, and those guys are now set up as example. Everybody's either massacred or sold off into slavery. So you've got this really severe example here now of what happens to you if you resist me, right? You resist me, you're going to get killed or sold into slavery, one of the two. That's what an example. So what is right below that? What do you think is right around here?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. What do you think they do? Come on in! Yeah, come on in. I mean, these guys have learned their lessons. Like, in fact, you look at it, it's really good that it went this way. Otherwise, you don't know what Jerusalem was a walled city. Remember, they rebuilt the wall, and it could very easily said, "We're going to hold up here and have a we'll fortify." But instead, they let the Greeks just roll on through, right? Almost like they're not even there. Alexander's very happy with that. They keep moving down. What do you think happens down here in Egypt?
Looks like the same thing. Don't see any battles.
There's no battles. You think the Egyptians are happy to have those guys come in?
Yeah, because they hate the Persians.
They hate the Persians. Yeah, it's like we have been unhappy about this for centuries, and you're going to come in and essentially one thing that the Greeks do here along the way is they allow the culture and the language and religion, they just leave it all alone. Remember we said the Persians were pretty tolerant? The Greeks are pretty tolerant too. In fact, he almost becomes Persian. So, very, very tolerant. The Egyptians can kind of have their own way down here. Oh, we're free of the Persians again. Now, he doesn't have to worry. He just does a big lap down here, and he can head out. But he does found the city of Alexandria, which still bears its name to this day up on the coast there. And so, it becomes a tremendous center of culture for centuries to come. So that's where the city of Alexandria is founded. It's basically celebrating him as a liberator. He liberated them from the Persians, who the Egyptians had been battling for 1,000 years. They were fighting these guys for a long, long time.
And the statues of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were very, very happy.
I know, I've seen it.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, still there?
Yeah, we were in Egypt there.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. In fact, this ends up becoming the capital of Egypt going forward, where under the pharaohs it's always been Memphis down up the Nile. So Egypt's done, right? The coast is clear here. I can have naval ships come in to supply us. My rear flank is cleared out. I head up. What's he going to do? He's coming for you. He's coming for Darius. So here he comes. He had gone through Gaza, entered Egypt. We talked about that. So then, big battle coming up. The Battle of Gaugamela. Got it on here?
No.
It's essentially here.
Or
Yeah. That's the Battle of Gaugamela. So this is the big one. This is where it just basically finally comes to a head. So now, Darius has had some time to kind of get everything together, get his army back organized again, and one last stand. But he's lost half of his empire by this point. If you look at it, and he's lost a lot of the good stuff, right? Asia Minor, the coast, the Mediterranean coast, Egypt. I mean, you've lost a lot of your empire, a lot of people, a lot of men, a lot of your economy has been lost. But here he comes. He is. Alexander's now coming with what he thinks is going to be the final blow. So this is 331 BC now. So it's taken 5 years for Alexander to get to this point. All right. So now you've got. This is again. We're moving kind of slow. We're moving on foot. The Battle of Gaugamela happens in 331, and interesting enough, this is about 62 miles west of the current city of Erbil, Iraq. So yeah, you're right about in here. This is modern day Iraq, right? The Tigris and Euphrates here. So the Battle of Gaugamela is happening right in here, right in the middle of what is present day Iraq. Darius had a good number of troops, been organized. He picked the ground. He's like, this is where we're going to have our battle. He had everything ready to go. Supplies were in place. Everything's ready to go. But despite all these factors. Alexander still outmaneuvers him with a smaller force, still flanks him, and what do you think Darius does? Runs away again. Darius runs away again, and source accounts state that when Darius perceived, how violent it was going to be and how bad he was going to lose at Issus, he turned his chariot around. He was the first one to flee again. In fact, they say so many Persians died that day that it ensured that Darius would never be able to field an army again. So the army was absolutely destroyed. He did attempt to raise the third army, but at this point, these guys are just draftees without training, and it never works out. So now the gateway is completely open for Alexander to head down and head towards the capital of Persepolis. He heads that way, and he's gonna just take out the capital, and that's gonna be it. Interesting note here. As we read a lot of accounts in the Bible about warfare, what are some of the things that pop out when you read about battles, like Pharaoh, or what's one of the ways they'll say how strong an army is? What's one of the things they talk about? How many chariots they have? Yeah, did you notice that? Especially it's very, very common to read that in the Bible. They'll talk about that this king had 1,000 chariots, or this king had 500 chariots, right? It's like today we'd say we have 1,000 tanks, we have 2,000 aircraft, right? It's the way of stating how strong an army is. Most of the Bible that we read, well, almost all of it, takes place during what we would call the Bronze Age. Bronze Age is about 2,000 to 700 BC. This is where most of the Bible takes place. And during the Bronze Age, chariots were the tanks of the day, right? If you could put chariots on the battlefield, it was like what a tank would be to infantry, right? How many soldiers would take out a tank today? Take a squad at least, right? You're talking about 10, 12 to 1. Same thing with chariots back in those days, right? It would be hard to take out a chariot. But remember we talked about Philip, Alexander's father developed a tactic that made it almost indestructible. It made chariots completely obsolete. So this is one reason why Darius loses. He's fighting with old technology, basically. Old strategies, old technologies. But just like tanks or airplanes, you just don't go and just whip up a bunch of chariots, right? If I lose all my chariots up here at Issus, Granicus or Issus, how long is it going to take you to reconstitute a chariot force? To breed horses, to train horses, build the chariots out of whatever it is, iron or whatever it is you build those things out of, train those guys to operate them. This is years, right? So if one battle happens, it's crippling. And that's what happens here. He's fighting with old tactics, old strategies, and it's expensive and it just cripples him. So Darius at this point is toast. He's done. So during the retreat here, when they get to Persepolis, Darius is betrayed by a couple of his closest confidants. Is that surprising? And of course, he is mortally wounded by one of them. They're trying to basically, they want to essentially trade him as a hostage, and he refuses. No, I can fight on. And so he gets stabbed by one of them. Is left to die. They take off. They flee. And when Alexander shows up, his people find Darius' dead body in an ox cart. So Alexander's very upset about this. He wanted to take the king, alive. He wanted to. He was wanting to become emperor of Persia. I think his ultimate goal was to be declared emperor. That was his goal. But he takes the signet ring off the dead king's finger and takes his body back to Persepolis for a royal, magnificent funeral and burial, and put him in the royal tombs and treat him like an emperor. So, and then Alexander eventually marries Darius III's daughter in 324, officially becoming the emperor of Persia. So now in 324, think about how fast this happened. From 336 to 324, we're talking about 12 years, he conquers all of Greece, right? He had to fight to keep that, and then liberates or conquers all of the Persian Empire, clear to the Indus River. We talked about this a week or two ago. Go over to the Indus River. And then he kind of makes a couple little mistakes. He decides, I'm going to go up here and take these pesky people in Afghanistan. How do you think that goes? Doesn't really go well. There's nobody that, pursues. Right? It's kind of like what we ran into there. Just kind of everywhere you go, they're in a cave, or it's impossible, right? And so he just kind of comes back down, tries to conquer India, but at this point his soldiers are just exhausted, homesick. This has been the same soldiers the whole time. Can you believe that? The same army he came across here with, he's conquered all of Persia with them. That's how light his losses were. But at this point, they're like, we would like to kind of go home. We've got enough. And so he agrees to turn the army around and heads back to Persepolis. And this is where he dies under very strange circumstances. It's not really sure if he was poisoned or if it's caught disease of some kind, but very unexpected, and did not have a succession plan built. I mean, this guy's young. He's how old is he here?
30.
He was born in 356, and
He's in his 30s, early 30s.
yeah, I mean, so he's
I think he
33
only
years
had-
old or something like that.
He only had the whole
Yeah,
place for about a year.
yeah, he
His
never.
last battle was about a year to when he died.
Yeah, he never got to really,
Get back
enjoy
to
the fruits of
Greece.
it. But the Greeks were in charge, and his generals were in charge, right? And the Persian army, the Persian nobility, had been wiped out. So there was no Persian brain trust left, right? There was parts of members of the royal family, but there was no, the infrastructure the Persians had set up had been completely wiped out, and the Greeks come through and just, in the short period of time that he was in charge, replaced everything. And what we call Hellenizes it. That's what we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks, is how the Greeks Hellenized this. So if you're a Jew living over here in Yehud, what's that mean to you? What's that? We might have to learn Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to learn another one, right? So now we're going to have to deal with 3 languages. And we see this in the Bible, right? We see this manifest itself later on, right? You've got the Hebrew Scriptures, right, which is their Bible. We've got the, right, that's not the language we speak another language, and all of a sudden now the ruling party comes in with a different language, and that's where all official business is going to be done. So this can be, a challenge for adapting and
That's what
assimilation.
we go back to, is the Greek Bible.
Say that again?
I said we go back to the Greek Bible.
This is how we end up with the Greek Bible. This is how we end up with the New Testament being written in Greek.
Yeah.
We're going to see that. So for 350 years, 380 years, Greek will be the predominant language now, because they are now the new masters. They are in charge. Spoiler alert, what we're going to talk about next week is that, so Alexander was the emperor. When he dies, there is what looks like to be a pretty quick, peaceful transition. Some of his key generals assume positions of authority. There is a little wrangling, but then it settles into four generals make themselves king. One over Greece back here, one over Asia Minor, one over Syria and all that to the east, and one over Egypt. So those 4 kings, those 4 generals settle in as kings to rule those areas. The one that would be in charge of Yehud here is actually the one that takes over Egypt. So king, he's a general. His name is Ptolemy. He takes over Egypt and basically Syria, much of Syria here. Remember, the Jews are always right on the border, right on the boundary. They're not off in a corner, so they're in a heavily used intersection, right? So what you're going to see for another 200 years or so is fighting over this land again. And the Jews find themselves in the middle of that. But it's Greeks fighting Greeks now. And so you're Greek. I know I'm going to speak Greek. I know Greek's the currency, Greek's the language. It's just who's in charge. That's basically the argument now for another 200 years. So next week we'll talk about how it dissolves and what happens here. What happens to these guys now that they have a new king. Thoughts, comments? That was Alexander the Great, 40 minutes. Yes, sir.
The Old Testament was translated into Greek.
It was. We're going to talk about by one of his descendants. Yeah. Ordered by one of his descendants. We're going to talk about that next week, actually. Yeah. This is actually a pretty good thing.
Was Cleopatra part of the
She was a Ptolemy.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
what I thought.
Yep.
Okay.
Look into that. Yeah, we get all the way down to Cleopatra. There were many Cleopatras.
Yeah,
That was a
well, the
common
one
name.
we all know.
Like Ptolemy. This would be Ptolemy the first. I think when we get to Cleopatra, I can't remember which Ptolemy it is, like the 6th or something. But Yeah, one of his descendants is the king, but there's a challenge whether Cleopatra has a challenge. Remember, these guys all do the same thing. They are all eliminating threats to their throne, right? That's a lot of what they do. So Cleopatra actually is kind of a threat. That's how the Romans get involved. She calls for Roman help, and that's how she gets involved in Mark Antony. So we'll look at that. But yeah, this Ptolemy the First, he is one of Alexander's generals that takes over. One of his descendants, in about 130 years or so, will order the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. And that Bible that gets translated into Greek by these guys becomes the Bible of Jesus and the apostles. We've talked about this before in some classes, but this is very, very interesting. This is how important this is. When you read Matthew, and Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, that Greek that Matthew wrote in, of that quote, is that Bible. It's called the Septuagint. And it's only called Septuagint because 70 scribes came down and translated. So Sept for 70. It's actually 72. They rounded to 70. So these guys were brought down to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek for these guys. This is not bad guys. They're like, we're going to assimilate. We want your Bible in our library. But I can't read this Hebrew thing. Can you translate this to Greek for us? Sure. The king calls you and says, come down and translate it? Sure. Right? That's what it was. That Bible, this thing in Greek, is what Jesus quotes in the book of Matthew. That's pretty interesting. I would say it was a pretty important translation, pretty important thing, right? How would Matthew read otherwise? Like, how would Matthew have written that? If he's going to write this thing in Greek, would there be a bunch of Aramaic mixed in there instead, kind of like what there is now? Like, remember, he says some Aramaic quotes. But, this is a very clear translation. What did Jesus say? He said that. Well, Greek. That's the whole thing's written in Greek. So it's easier for us to understand. It's easier for us to blend.
The whole world had Greek.
The whole world had it.
That had been conquered, so...
Yeah, people from all over this kingdom could come down to Alexandria and read that thing. Pretty important. Wouldn't have happened if Alexander hadn't come through here, thrown the Persians out, set a different language in place, right? A language that goes broader. If we keep looking this way, what's going to happen in a couple hundred years is we start involving these guys, right? One thing the Romans did, this is my personal interpretation, the Romans did not impose Latin like the Greeks imposed Greek or the Persians imposed Aramaic. I mean, you didn't see, I don't see any evidence of the Romans going around saying, you must speak Latin. In fact, if anything, they almost kind of left it as like, this is our language, So that's just my take. So you didn't get this imposition of Latin across this land like this when the Romans took over. They really didn't do that. Any other thoughts? Is there?
Well, I don't want to step on too many toes going forward, but talk about the structure of the language, but also the ideas of these philosophical ideas that are coming up and trying to gain understanding and reason, and how important that is coming forward too. That people are kind of open to ideas, open to interpretations. Whereas before it's like, no, that's not our culture. That's not what we do. Yours is foreign. Yours is wrong. Yours is evil.
Yeah. Great point. Yeah, remember a few weeks ago we were talking about these guys were challenging conventional wisdom, challenge the way you think, we'll talk about this as we go forward too, but this idea of fate and of destiny. These are kind of strange concepts, right? As opposed to, I'm just a subject to a king, He comes in with this idea that let's think differently. Let's behave differently. And those seeds all got sown a couple hundred years earlier here in Greece. Anything else? Wraps up. Now you know what Alexander is, who he was, what he did, how he got in charge, and how we got a Greek Bible today. We talk about Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. This is the origins of how they became Greek. How that happened, right? So when you read about that in the New Testament, oh, okay, this happened in the mid-330s. The Greeks came in throughout the Persians that we read about at the end of the Old Testament. We read about that. This is the first connection now that takes us into this New Testament period of time. So this is the first of these three major watershed events. One is this transformation from Persian to Greek. Transformation from the old to the new. You see it start to happen here now. The modern world now comes and replaces the old world. That's all we got. Next week we're going to break down what happens after Alexander's death and what happens in this area here, which can be pretty brutal, but it's that second watershed event we're going to look at. Very, very, very important. All right, we'll see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.